think about our study, when we think about how we got the Bible, as we say, it's more than just a history lesson. It's more than just interest or anything like that. But it shows us the power of God in preserving His Word for us. And we'll jump into the middle of where we were, or last week, where we got up to. And then we'll see if we can make some sense of our lesson for today. And as we know, the actual writings, the original letters that Paul wrote and Peter wrote and James and John and all the writings of the New Testament were done on paper, papyrus paper. That was the rough, crude paper they had made out of reeds. And we don't have any of the originals left. They just didn't last. But fortunately, by about 300 AD, they invented this very thin leather called vellum. And so the best we can do in our search is to go back to around 300 BC to hope for some manuscripts, copies of the letters, early letters, that are on leather, on vellum. So that's our goal. You know, we're all off on a journey. Our goal is to get back in time as far as we can, closest to the days of Jesus and the apostles, of course. Why are we looking for that? Well, because as time goes by, and as we've said, as we recopy, inadvertent errors begin to creep in. They're not important doctrinal errors at all, but just a misspelling of a word, or leaving out a word, or whatever, as we do as humans when we copy stuff. So we're on our quest to go back as far as we can. In this case, in the Greek language, because the early church, all the writings of the New Testament were in Greek. All right. Now, our quest is not as easy as it sounds, because when we find an old text way back in a dusty bin somewhere, we have to date it, and it takes a while to figure out, looking at the writing and the script and the way the words were made, what its date is. We've talked about that. So this morning, we're going to talk about 3 major finds that have occurred, well, really just come to light in the last couple hundred years, about pretty good, pretty intact early manuscripts, which are copies of the originals of the New Testament in the Greek language. The first one is called the Vatican manuscript, and it was from about 300 AD. So it's really good. That's as close as we're probably going to find for anything written on vellum. As the name implies, the Vatican manuscript is in the Vatican Library in Rome. It's been there 400 or 500 years, but for a long time it was very, very, very closely guarded. And people really couldn't look at it and study it and all such as that very well. However, nowadays, since we've got copy machines and photographs and the internet, it's been publicized out so people can study it and look at it a whole lot better. It's a very high quality. It contains practically all of the books of the Old and New Testament, but as is common, a few pages are missing here and there, simply because it's so old and it's very, very easy to lose a page. And as we said, it has 759 pages, 759 pages of leather, so I'm sure it would stack up this high. It's very high quality, very handsome. There's columns on a page. Let's see here. I'm looking at the middle of the page here. Each page is about 10 inches square. all right, 10 inches square. There's 3 columns. The writing is very good. All right, that's the Vatican manuscript. Second one that we're going to talk about is what's called the Sinai manuscript, and it's dated around 350 AD. And how did this thing get its name? Well, we all know that Mount Sinai was a major place in the Old Testament. That's where God came down to Moses and gave the 10 Commandments and the law and all that. And we're not quite sure where Mount Sinai is. For a long time it's thought to be in Egypt, the far eastern edge of Egypt. Some people today think it's probably over in Saudi Arabia, but we're not sure. But through the centuries, the churches in that area, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, they would build monasteries or something like that on some of these holy sites, near these holy sites, because they considered them holy, and if a monastery needed to be built somewhere, they wanted to go to a holy place so they could feel closer to God and all that. So there's a monastery near the traditional site of Mount Sinai over in Egypt. And the monks there, spend their time in prayer and study and work and all such as that. So it stands to reason, as we're looking for old documents, that might be a good place to go. And sure enough, in the mid-1800s, there's a German Bible scholar called Tischendorf. It's not important for you to remember that name, but his name is Tischendorf. And he was a real hound dog on the text of the early New Testament and doing the best he could to gather up old texts. So he makes a pilgrimage from Germany to this monastery there in Egypt near the Mount Sinai area. And he's out of place, of course, and he's snooping around, looking around, and it was wintertime, I think, and the monks were building a fire to keep warm. And supposedly, now I don't know how true some of this is, but they were using some old papers to start the fire with. And so he gets one and looks at it, and he recognizes it as being ancient. And not only that, it looks like it could be a translation of part of the Bible. And so he says, don't do that. Can I look at a few of these pages? And he did. And he was so excited. He was so excited that he gave himself away. And then the monks got real suspicious of him. Why are you so excited about seeing what you saw? What's the deal here? And so he didn't get any farther in getting any more information from this monastery, and he finally had to go home. So he had to use his brain a little bit. If he can't work directly, he's got to go behind the scenes to the power players that can maybe help him out. And this was in around 1860, somewhere in there. All right. The Orthodox Church, as we call it today, is just the first cousin wide off from the Roman Church, Roman Catholic Church. The Orthodox Church was more in Greece and Russia, and then the Roman Church was in Italy and the rest of Europe. It just so happened that the Russian Orthodox Church was really over this monastery here at Mount Sinai. So this Tischendorf goes to the king of Russia, and they call their kings czars, if you remember, the Tsar of Russia, and uses all the influence he can through the Russian church and the king of Russia to get some influence back on this monastery at Mount Sinai. It takes him 15 years. He takes 15 years, he goes back. So he makes his visit, knocks on the door, and they accept him and everything. And he strikes out for a few days, and they're still sort of cold to him and not very open. He gets ready to go, but they said, well, I tell you what, we'll let you look at one manuscript. And he drops his teeth when he sees this manuscript, because it's early Greek scripture, and he knows it. And they said, you can look at it all night, but you have to give it back tomorrow when you leave. He stayed up all night long just looking at it, and just unbelievable, the quality and the completeness of this text. So he had to leave the next day, had to leave the document there. But he got the king of Russia eventually to get that document, and it went back to the king of Russia. Now, that was the late 1800s, but if you remember, the Russian Tsar was overthrown and killed in 1917, and the communists took over. Did the communists care about God and Scripture? No. They said that's ridiculous. They banned Bibles. They banned much church activity. And so, to our credit, to our benefit, the Russians in 1933 said, we don't need this document. Let's see if we can sell it. So they sold it to the Brits, and it's in the British Museum. They would rather have the money in 1930s than an early copy of Scripture. So this Sinai manuscript is what we call it today. And all 27 books of the New Testament are there, and they're complete. There's no gaps, no pages missing. The vellum is outstanding quality, and it dates to around 350 AD. And so this was a very good manuscript, all right? That's the Sinai manuscript. The third one that we have, that's a big heavyweight, is one called the Alexandrian manuscript, and that's named after, I guess, Alexandria, Egypt. But it ended up in the hands of the King of England. And it's been in the royal family for some years, and it's now in the British Library. It's also very high quality. Now, it's just, even though these things date back to the 300s and 400s, they haven't really been open to study except for the last maybe 150 years or so. And that's very interesting. That's very interesting. All right. When we think about that, we also then need to think about, are there other sources that we might use to help us in our quest to go back to, as close as we can, to the original letters of the New Testament. And there's a couple of little things that have happened through the years that are very interesting. As we said, when this vellum thin layer was made, they would rub it on a rock and get it just as thin as you would pie dough, pie crust. Just get it just as thin as you could, and then they'd write on it with their pens. But it was so hard to make, it was so valuable, that sometimes they would reuse it. Of all things, they would take an old document that wasn't very important, they thought, and wash it and redo it, and wash it and redo it, and then write over it again. And we would call this a re-script. Script, of course, meaning to write, and re means to do again, so this is called a re-script document. And sure enough, lo and behold, a document was found. The top layer of writing was from the 1100s, and that's way too recent to be of much use to our quest today. But the more they looked at it, they could see that there's something underneath the first level of writing, but there's something underneath there. And so these experts looked and read, and sure enough, underneath that was Scripture. The earliest writing underneath is from the 400s, and it was Scripture. A lot of the Old Testament is missing, and there's a few leaves missing from the New Testament. But this was not really publicized until 1845, like I said, you know, a couple hundred years ago or so. So that's interesting. Now, can you imagine how hard up these people were for writing materials that they would reuse a piece of leather? But that's how valuable it was. And as I say, Scripture was so valuable in their minds that they did their best to preserve it and write it and make copies. Okay. Now, another source that we found was in the late 1500s, and this was an early manuscript that had the Greek language on one side of the page and the Latin language on the other side of the page. Just parallel passages in two different languages. Because as time went on, Latin became the language of a lot of the educated areas of Europe and all that, and of course became the language of the Catholic Church as they had their masses and everything. And so there's an early translation of Greek into Latin, and that helps us in some regard. Now, as we said last week as well, by the Middle Ages, people began to, instead of writing just in block print, they began to write in cursive writing, cursive letters, just like we do, just like we learned. But that didn't start around 800. And so to the 800s, to the Middle Ages, we can find manuscripts that are in cursive. But if we find a cursive manuscript, then that just means it's so late, it's 800 or later, that it's probably not of much value to us, since it's pretty much later in time. But one of the things that we might point out about these cursives from the Middle Ages, vellum was beginning to be more mass-produced. It was less trouble to make, and so it was a little bit more plentiful. And so instead of cramming all their writing just as close as they could, some of the copyists, some of the scribes that were talented would draw little pictures or elaborate the first word of a first letter of a word. You know, instead of making just a block A, they would, you know, really decorate the A and all that. Maybe you've seen some pictures of these medieval documents that are like that. They would embellish or illustrate a little bit. That's the word. Illustrate a little bit on the margins. So that's that. Another thing we have as a source, not a major source, but helpful, is something we would call a lectionary, which is a small portion of Scripture that was copied off to be read in church. All right, say I get the call today to read Scripture in church, and I can get my Bible, and I could probably find 50 or 100 Bibles in this church if I needed to find one real fast. Or if I have the technology, I can pick up my phone and turn to Scripture, and I can read from that. But back a few years ago, if I were called to read Scripture today, and I had a 759-page Bible that stood this far up on me, I'd have trouble getting some help to get that book up there, or books, or however we did it, to read something. So they would copy off a portion of Scripture for the Sunday Scripture reading. Just like we might do it in our bulletins or our handouts or something like that. That's what they did. And this was called a lection, or then the little copy would be called a lectionary. And so sure enough, we found some of those through the years of portions of Scripture that were copied off for church reading, a lectionary. All right. Then, as we continue our quest for early manuscripts, our gold standard, as we know, would be the original Greek language that the New Testament was written in. However, if we could find an early translation that even not in the Greek, in another language, that would still go back to the early 300s or so, that would be wonderful as well. So sure enough, we found some of those through the years. Archaeologists have found, or I guess I don't know if they're called archaeologists, but the researchers that look into all this have found scripture in the language of Syria called Syriac. We know where Syria is. It's just north of modern Israel, and the Syriac language in that time went from Syria all the way over to Iraq. All right, we know that part of the country, the Middle East now. And this Syriac language was very kin to Hebrew, or the common language that Jesus spoke and his disciples was Aramaic. Aramaic is a subset of Hebrew, but this Syriac is a subset of that. So there's some early versions of Scripture that are in the Syriac language that we found, and they date back to the 400s. Okay? Not the gold standard, but we'll call it the silver standard. You know, I'm not quite back to the primary source, but I got a good translation in a different language, but yet it looks like it's very, very old. And so that's probably a good thing. So there's some of that. But here's the sad part, and this is just a comment off the side. All of the country, Syria, over to modern day Iran, Iraq, and back, is all Muslim today. Almost no Christian churches there. 2,000 years ago, there was scripture in the native tongues of the people. They're gone. And a lot of the Christians were murdered at the edge of a sword to convert. And that's not good. And we think about that and we think, how terrible. But you know, the Apostle Paul, when he went on his missionary journeys, and he established churches all through modern day Turkey. Is Turkey a Christian nation? No. So we think, well, I tell you what, they started out and they had heard the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and they went off and spread the gospel, and it died out. That's the sad part. That's the sad part. And we're just one generation away, everywhere, of that happening. So it's incumbent upon us to keep our youngsters here, keep our families, and we've got to do that. And that's obvious, but I just wanted to support that. All right. Come to find out, going back to this monastery at Mount Sinai, this is now in the late 1800s, 30, 40 years after the first manuscript was found. They found another manuscript there that was a rescript, one that had been written over again, and it was a very good document. And even though it was in Syriac, it was copied from a very, very, probably a 2nd century version, so that was helpful to us. All right, as time goes by, Greek, which was the language of the educated people in that portion of the world at that time, was, of course, the blessing of God that the New Testament was written in Greek so that it could spread well. But as time went by, Latin became another classical language, as we know, especially up through Europe It was the language of the church there. And so, if we can find an early Latin translation of Scripture, that would be wonderful as well. And we might say, well, what's wrong with a translation? We don't have to go all the way to the original Greek version if we can find a good Latin or Syriac translation. Well, I don't know anything about that. I've never studied a foreign language, so I'm just reading and telling you what I read. But, we think translation is just A equals B. You get this word in Greek and you put it in English. You get this word in Greek and you put it in Latin or whatever. But we all know that there's nuances and variations and figures of speech that you can't translate, sort of word for word. You have to sort of know the context. Here's what I'm talking about. In our English language, we have one word, love, L-O-V-E. And that encompasses everything from the love of God to loving my wife to loving ice cream. And that's how poor our English language is, because we don't differentiate between those two. But the Greek language had 3 different words. One for romantic love, man and woman, and one for friendship love, brotherly love, or like ice cream, or like my friends. But the superlative love is godly love. It's not dependent upon us. It's not dependent upon the deservingness of the receiver. But the love of God is dependent upon His nature, flawless, eternal nature. So, that's why I say it's better to go back to the Greek original, if we can, to get a better, clearer picture of our Scriptures. All right. The Latin versions began to come out very, very soon after the time of Christ, 300 or 400 years. Actually, one of them, I think, maybe come out around 150. Some of the Latin translations began, and they're very good. It just so happened that there were so many of them that one of the bishops of Rome in 382 AD, which is not too far after the time of Christ, 382 says, we need to clean up our translations a little bit. We got too many variations and some errors around here, so he appointed a guy named Jerome in 382 to say, look, your job is to clean everything up and go back best you can and have one good Latin version of the New Testament. And he did. He worked on it for several years, of course, and around 385 or so, he had his version come out, and it's called the Latin Vulgate, V-U-L-G-A-T-E. I don't know where that word came from, but that was their standard Bible, the Latin Vulgate for the Latin Church. And even it was effective. It was used for 1,000 years, it said, and even today it's still the official version of the Roman Catholic Church, is this early Latin Vulgate that was translated way back in right at 400 AD. So these are good, and as I say, the Vulgate is still the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church today. All right, so that's interesting. All right, one other thing before we move to another section. Yes, we have people that are serious about copying Scripture. Copyists, scribes. But what about other writers? Were there other writers, popular writers, Christian writers that want to send letters or sermons around or whatever, or teachings around to churches? Yes, of course, just like today. And of course, these writers would would quote a scripture or two in their sermon or in their letter that they wrote to a church. If an early writer was writing a letter to a church about giving, you need to be generous. You need to give of your funds to support the church and the missions and the benevolence and everything. So that writer might quote from Paul to say, it's better to give than to receive, and something like that. Just a verse or two. But it means that the words he quoted are just like we see in our early text, so we know that he or she, whoever was writing, had an early translation, an early version as well. So that just helps support this whole idea of God preserving Scripture for us, on and on. Now, all the smart people that have the time and money and education to do that is just over my head. And it takes a bookworm to be interested in this. It takes a lot of brain power to do this. And we say, well, yeah, it took some strokes of luck. No, it took the hand of God to arrange all of this. The discoveries, even in the last couple hundred years, it took the hand of God to get us to where we are today. All right, we're going to move on to another topic, but any comment or question before we go? Any question or topic? Question? Comment?
This just reinforces the idea that there were no, even a township would even have a copy of Scripture. I mean, it would be very, very regional or whatever,
Yeah.
that you'd find somebody that had a copy of Scripture.
Yes. It'd be very, nobody had none of the common people had Scripture. None. And even in our day, and this is to my wife's credit, she prompted me to remember this. We have a term in our families, a family Bible. Who has the family Bible? That came down from great-great-grandparents to the grandparents and the grandparents. And that was a custom we had many years ago. Before we had so many Bibles, we had a family Bible. And in the front, there was probably some, genealogies of when people were born and stuff. And I would say that as America was settled, and the East Coast moved west, the pioneers in their wagons and in their carts had pots and pans. But they also probably had a family Bible. Does anybody have an old family Bible that you have, keep? Jim? Yeah. It's precious, isn't it? It's precious. And I don't know, I remember when I was a kid, seeing it, but I don't know where it is and who has it. I wish now I'd have paid attention more. The family Bible. Okay. All right. Now, when we think about, yes, sir, Dr. May.
There's an old quotation, I can't tell you who said it. To a believer, no proof is necessary.
Okay.
To an unbeliever, no proof is sufficient.
Yes.
The fact of the matter is, this is back to faith. You can believe what you want to believe, and we all have instances. We go back where we were told something, and we believe it. We don't know whether it's true or not,
Right.
but we believe it. So to us, it's true.
Yeah. Yes.
And no one's going to talk you out of it. And if you're honest, you have some of that in your mind.
Yeah.
So it comes back to faith. Because some of this is very difficult. Some's been destroyed, some's been adulterated.
Yeah.
It comes back to your faith. Do you believe that there is a God? Do you believe that there is a God in control? And this is His Scripture.
And on top of that, as you say, to a skeptic, there can never be enough proof. To a believer, a modern day revelation, a modern day scripture that's come upon us 200 years ago, translated from gold plates that a guy found in the middle of the forest at night, so to speak, doesn't stand up to the investigation and the proof that we have. And it's on purpose it doesn't stand up, because I don't believe it's from God. And so these are just supporters. Yes, Dr. May, these are supporters. We have faith that this is Scripture. And this just helps us along. Yes, sir. Good. Matt?
It does say, faith doesn't make it easy, faith makes it possible.
Faith doesn't make it easy, it makes it possible. Yes. So true. And that's life, you know. If we're believers, we're going to have the same problems as everybody else. But we get through it with God's help, right? Yes, sir. All right. Well, when we think about these little quirky errors that we say in copying, you know, when we have something printed nowadays, you know, it's set in type, and you can print one or you can print 1,000,000, and they're all just alike. They're all just alike. And we have copy machines. We can stick something on the copy machine and great. But as we say, think about copying stuff by hand and how easy it is for us to make a mistake. I was thinking the other day, what if we were given an assignment of recopying the Gatesville phone book? Getting names and numbers correct. It'd be rough, wouldn't it? So we'll continue there next week. Thank you.